good morning and good afternoon to all of you who are joining us for this technical workshop on green finance for sustainable agriculture and food systems. I am Azeta Tsungu. I'm a Rural Finance Officer with the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations based in Rome. As you know, this event is being co-organized by the CAPFIN Partnership and the SAFIN Network. And I think most of you already know CAPFIN and SAFIN. But just in a nutshell, if we have colleagues who are joining us for the first time, CAPFIN is a long-standing partnership that brings together rural and agricultural finance experts from 7 international development agencies with the aim of fostering the agenda for inclusive rural and agricultural finance through creating and sharing knowledge as well as strengthening capacities of the various stakeholders. Right now, the member organizations in CAPFIN are the CGAP, the FAO, GIZ, IFAD, the World Food Programme, UNCDF, and the World Food Programme. SAFIN, on the other hand, is the Smallholders and Agri-SMEs Finance and Investment Network. It is a global network of actors that come together with the purpose of building a better functioning financial ecosystem for small and medium enterprises in agriculture and food. Let us, at this opening session, give the floor to Adriano Campolina and Arindom Datta, who will be saying some welcoming words and addressing the workshop participants on behalf of the organizers. Adriano is the team leader of the Rural Institutions, Services and Empowerment team in FAO, where the Inclusive Rural Finance area of work is housed, and he will be addressing the workshop on behalf of CAPFIN Partnership. Arindom is Executive Director and Head of the Rural and Development Banking and Advisory at Rabobank. He is also a member of SAFIN's steering committee, and he will be speaking on behalf of SAFIN. So let me now give the floor to Adriano. The floor is yours to start with the opening.
Thank you very much, Azeta, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, colleagues. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today and to be part of this important event on green finance for sustainable agricultural practices and food systems on behalf of the CAPFIN Partnership. We consider the topic of today's workshop to be of fundamental importance for the pursuit of multiple development goals. As you know, evidence suggests that agricultural development is one of the most powerful tools to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including those related to climate change and the environment, to building resilient livelihoods in rural areas, to fostering inclusive growth, reducing poverty and malnutrition, and so much more. In 2013, agriculture accounted for 1/3 of the global GDP. Therefore, it is clear that greening agriculture is central to greening the economy and the planet. Even more so, considering that the sector contributes disproportionately to the CO2 emissions and global warming. On the other hand, the greening of agriculture cannot be achieved without practices are going to the food system stakeholders at the necessary speed and scale and with impact. In reality, despite recent progress, agriculture remains underserved by financial institutions and suffers from underinvestments. This is even more pronounced for certain market segments and sectors such as the smallholder farmers, agri-MSMEs, women and youths, and green and sustainable finance, the latter being the focus of the present workshop. I take this opportunity to encourage us to think at how finance can support the shift to environmental sustainability in agriculture and food, but also to more inclusive systems that leave no one behind. Finance is an important cornerstone in the global development agenda and the achievement of SDGs when it makes things happen that are truly sustainable and sound on all 3 dimensions, including economic, social, and environmental. I believe that the issues addressed in the workshop are truly central to the efforts being made at all levels to advance the case for green and sustainable finance in agriculture and food, but also for improving inclusivity. I would like to single out the role of the enabling conditions, such as policies, regulations, and incentives that we know are of key importance. And related to this, is the catalytic role of the public sector, whether in building the necessary stakeholder capabilities, infrastructures, generating and sharing information and evidence, supporting the development of bankable and inclusive green projects, and working with all stakeholders to make green investments in agriculture and food commercially viable, so that more and more private source of capital can be mobilized and resources channeled to environmentally, socially, and economically sound pursuits. I am honored to represent CABFIN in this meeting. As FAO, we are proud to be a co-founder and contributor to the partnership. We think CABFIN represents an asset for the inclusive rural and agricultural finance community of practice and a worthy model of inter-agency cooperation. As a partnership with global relevance, CABFIN and its member organizations are working closely with partners and stakeholders at all levels. This partnership-based approach helps us to ensure that our work is not only reflective of multiple perspectives and responsive to global priorities and local realities, but also that it is evidence-based and actionable, so that joint efforts can translate into results on the ground. Today, we are very happy to co-host this workshop together with our colleagues at SAFIN. I would like to conclude by expressing my compliments and appreciation to both teams, CABFIN and SAFIN, for what promises to be a very interesting and engaging event on a topic that's really at the top priority for everyone in the sector. Thank you very much. I wish you a very fruitful workshop, and I wish to also encourage all of us to look at this fundamental interdependence between inclusivity and sustainability, and how we face exactly the same challenge to both sides of this equation. I wish you an excellent workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriano. Arindam, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Ezeta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants and all the speakers. It's a pleasure for me to address this event. Now, I'm speaking from New Delhi, which is not only a COVID hotspot, but it's also a climate hotspot here. Now, I'll make one general comment about green financing and 4 specific comments. The general comment is green financing is evolving, it's niche, and the protocols around taxonomy, standards, and measurements are work in progress. So we need to appreciate that it's a long journey ahead, and we are undergoing the journey together. Now, the first specific comment I would like to make is on SDG 17 and the relevance of SDG 17. That's about partnerships and collaboration. Since climate is such a complex challenge and financing for solutions which addresses the climate issues as an even bigger challenge, we require active participation and collaboration of not only the private sector, the public sector, but also the development sector and the community at large. Now, it's easier said than done because the devil is in the details. Now, there are institutional limitations and cultural limitations to such collaborations, and I will stick my neck out with my experience of dealing with multiple stakeholders across the globe that it's more of a cultural bottleneck or cultural limitations that we as institutions cannot work with other sectors. We require champions, and I do hope that networks like SAFIN and events like this, it helps us to identify the right kind of champions who can collaborate with other sectors to make green financing happen. That's one. Second, the issue of blended finance. Extremely important because climate risk, when we are talking about businesses which are addressing the issue of transition or adaptation, these are all very new businesses. And it's not easy always for the mainstream commercial financial providers to understand and to manage those risks and to protect their balance sheet. That's where a lot of non-commercial capital or soft capital is required. Now, this is extremely critical, and therein lies the requirement for the development sector, the multilaterals, and the governments and the private sector to work together. The next comment I would like to make, and it's extremely important in my sense because I'm based in Asia, is right now, green financing is a niche activity. It's a niche business for a lot of European niche funding agencies, large banks with their specialized services, or very niche green funds. I would like to see the large retail banks of China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Brazil to be doing the green financing, because that's when green financing is going to get mainstream. So it's a shout out, it's a cry out for the multilaterals, for the governments and the green funds to work with the large domestic funds, because these are the geographies, these are the countries which are facing the maximum climate risk. And this is where the action is. And this is where we need to unlock local domestic capital. Extremely important. Now, the last point I would like to make, and that has already been made by Adriano, is about inclusivity. Now, the cry for green financing is becoming very shrill. And somehow I do not see the S part of ESG or the inclusivity part being talked of much within green financing. Now, that is critical if we are talking of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Now, if the green financing agencies, they require the buy-in of large communities in Asia and Africa, of the governments and local institutions, then the social inclusive piece or the inclusivity piece is extremely important to be not only incorporated well in the green financing initiatives, but also to be talked of, so that it becomes very interesting and people would relate to it a lot more. Now, with that, I would like to thank the organizers again, and I wish this event all the very best. And I hope that the CAFIN partnership and the SAFIN network, it expands so that we have the right kind of stakeholders, the multi-stakeholders across sectors, across continents, working together to make this world a more climate-friendly place. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Arindom, and thank you, Adriano and Arindom, for your interventions and for the very interesting insights there. Now, before starting with the agenda items for today, I would like to take a few minutes to explain what this workshop is about, what we are aiming at with this, and the process for the coming 2 days, 2 afternoons on this side of the world where we are sitting. Let me start by reiterating on something that Adriano mentioned in his opening remarks earlier on in relation to the importance of agriculture and food systems for the global greening agenda. He said that, amongst other things, he said that the agricultural sector and the food sector, I think, together account for about 1/3 of the world's gross domestic product. That is, of course, quite impressive. If we add to this also the fact that this sector also uses about 60% of the globe's ecosystems, and it provides livelihoods for roughly 40% of the world population, it becomes pretty clear that for the shift to sustainability, agriculture and food are a problem, but also a solution. And I'd like to quote an FAO source from 2012, actually, saying that there will be no greening of the economy without agriculture. Now, despite of this compelling need, as you all know, upscaling green finance and sustainable finance in the sector has been a little bit of a challenge. And we know that the reasons are many and the challenges are many. I'm not going to go into this now in the interest of time, but just to say that a lot of these challenges and gaps are still there and begging and crying to be addressed, despite of the progress that has been made in the more recent years, as a matter of fact. I just wanted to say that with respect to this, the technical sessions of this workshop have been designed to really go deeper into some of these key challenges, looking at the problems and the issues and the bottlenecks, but also the drivers for change, and also some of the answers and the solutions that are emerging out there. Why is it important to upscale green finance for agriculture? If we want to align finance to the real needs of the economy in the long run, we need to upscale green finance, and importantly so in agriculture for the reasons that we mentioned earlier on. I think it's very clear that the shift to sustainability, it's a time-bound process. We don't have a lot of time, as a matter of fact. If I'm correct, it was 2018 when the IPPC came out with a statement saying that if we wanted to keep the global warming, the increase in the temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius within this century, we needed to cut CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030. And we are not talking about a long time down the road. We are talking about really 9 years from now, basically, not 2030. So it is really about accelerating and scaling up that we should be talking about and we should be working on. What we need is to make green investments and sustainable investments in agriculture and food the mainstream, the normal, really. And therefore, we need green finance to come in, to flow in at the right scale and speed, basically. And are we really doing that? Are we moving fast enough? What are the hurdles that we have on our way, and what is it that needs to be done in order to get where we need to be going? This is really what this workshop will be zooming into, talking about. It will look at the key challenges, as I mentioned, and gaps, and it will look at the solutions that are emerging and the innovations. In these 2 days, we are going to hear from the experts. We are going to exchange our views. We will be learning from the experiences and the innovations that are taking hold. And we also hope that the workshop will provide us all, including the organizers, CAFIN and SAFIN, and SAFIN, concrete elements, concrete entry points to define our own work agendas going forward in this very important area of work. Now, let us look at the program for these 2 days. We will start day one, today, with a presentation that looks at the current state of green finance in agriculture and food. It will bring to our audience the key findings from a stock-taking exercise study that is being carried out by CAPFIN in collaboration with APRACA, the Rural and Agricultural Credit Association for Asia and the Pacific. This will then be followed by moderated discussions and interactions with the audience. Subsequent sessions then, session 2, session 3 in the following days will be building on some of these key issues that are coming out of this stock-taking exercise. In session 2, technical session 2, we will be focusing on the opportunities and the barriers for upscaling green investments in agriculture and food, those aspects that relate to the role of the public sector, to the ecosystem aspects and the enabling environment. Again, this session is organized around the keynote speaker, and then we will have panel discussion with selected experts. On day 2, tomorrow, we will have technical session 3 that takes us into the realm of innovations and solutions. We will have 3 parallel sessions there that zero in on specific examples of innovations at product, project, and enabling environment level. Each session will be organized internally into presentations and, again, moderated discussions. There will be reporting back session after that, where the key takeaways from each one of these 3 parallel sessions will be presented so that all participants have a chance to hear to what were the main insights in each one of these sessions, including in those where they could not personally participate. And finally, session 4 is actually dedicated to SAFIN. It's an internal planning session of SAFIN to discuss about future work of the network in the area of green finance for agriculture and food. This is open to SAFIN members only. Okay, I think with this, we are ready to go for day 1. We will start this session with the presentation that I already mentioned on the findings of the stock-taking study that is being carried out by CAPFIN and AFRACA. The presentation covers a lot of ground, but in this particular workshop, we'll mainly go into looking at the trends, innovations, challenges, and remaining gaps that need to be addressed. Our presenter is Mr. Prasoon Kumar Das, who has been working on the preparation of the study. Prasoon is the General Secretary of APRACA. Our moderator will be Panos Varangis, Panos is a principal agricultural finance expert with IFC, the International Finance Corporation. He is also an active member of the CAPFIN and an active contributor to the CAPFIN partnership. In the interest of time, of course, as you see, I'm just mentioning the names, titles, and current affiliation of the speakers and various contributors. But for you to know, you can find the details on the rich careers and professional achievements of all our speakers, moderators, panelists, and so on. In the website of SAFIN, there is a dedicated page there, and also in CAPFIN's Rural Finance and Investment Learning Center. We will be sending the links then later on in the chat, so you can go and check those out. With this, I would like to invite, I'm hoping I haven't forgotten anything important. Yeah, so I would like to invite the participants, when they have comments and questions to ask, please type them in the chat. So I would like to invite now Prasoon to start with his presentation. Prasoon is joining us from Bangkok. Thank you so much, Prasoon, for joining us. It's rather late now in Bangkok, I think. And also I would like to invite Panos to take charge for this session, actually, with the presentation of Prasoon. So I think with this, Prasoon, we are ready to go. If you're ready, we are ready. So you can share the screen. Yes. Okay, fantastic. We see you now. Yes.
Yeah. Can you see the presentation, please?
Yes, we see your screen.
Yeah. So
yes, we can looks good.
Yeah. Good afternoon from Bangkok, and good morning to my colleagues. Thank you, Ajita, for this generous introduction and an opportunity for me to work on this green finance landscaping study. On behalf of Praka, we are really happy to support CAPFIN partnership. I think we are working with them for last 10-15 years. So this the outline of the, I will go straight to the outline because we will be very limiting ourselves on the work we have done. The introduction, understanding the taxonomy, drivers, global trends, climate finance to agri-food, green finance to agri-food, innovations and findings. There will be some overlapping of the terminologies. Please forgive me for that, as Arindam was also telling that we are still in the work in process or work in progress for these taxonomical issues. So first, now there are some pain points which we all know how this paper came and why we are interested in this. The issues are already taken up by Adriano, by Arindam, by Ajita. So I don't want to go into detail, but just a point that we actually, agriculture, although it's very important, but at the same time, they are also the greatest cause of the biodiversity and the global greenhouse gas emission. So there are certain pain points and the thematic areas, like climate change continues to increase the strain of the global food system. That is also very, very important. And small-scale agricultural actors, who are 85% of the global agricultural business, encounter a number of challenges. Everybody knows it. Green finance to agriculture is a subject barriers that have traditionally affected the agricultural development finance. And as Panos said a few days back, that it's a double challenge for all of us. So what is now the engagement and action taken by global community? Yes, Arindam was telling that we need to have a global community need to take some action, and we have already taken action. So some of the action already said that some of the investment flows and the gaps are already been considered. And as a study of FAO, IFAD and all these things, they have said that there is a minimum of $105 billion needed annually for the global adaptation of the climate change to actually support the agricultural and food system. Then the Food and Land Coalition, they said that you need $300 to $350 billion for transition towards sustainable food system by 2030. The recent report of IFAD, along with CPI, estimated that there is a $500 billion in 2017 and 18, but but only 10 billion of this actually reached the small farm, which is a very, very alarming point. Now, the approach of the paper is starting with understanding the taxonomy, the landscaping, a global trend, innovations, then green finance ecosystem, policy regulation impacts, and then we go to the conclusion and the next steps. So coming to the understanding of taxonomy, what we found that there are 4 major terminology which are coming into the wave, which is sustainable finance, green finance, and climate finance, and then finally we come to the green finance to agriculture. The first 3, sustainable finance, green finance, and climate finance, are somehow already been developed and already been defined by many of the organizations, but green finance to agriculture need to be further refined and defined. But recently, of late, there is a development, we call it the inclusive green finance, which we had this terminology is being used by GIZ and AFI very, very often now. And then it is basically it's coming into a kind of where you have a national strategy which will be covering not only agriculture but the environmental, health, social and economic effects of the climate change. So these are the areas. But what I say that these are all nested definition. So we need to understand that it's all listed, and we have to define it differently, or maybe we have to come to a conclusion that these are the real definition. Now coming to the drivers of green finance. See, when we go to the global green finance index value of 2021, what we found that the policy and regulatory framework is the most important driver, not the loss of biodiversity, not the food security or the water quality, but it is the policy and regulatory framework. Then it comes the investor side, the demand side, the investors' demand. It is not the demand side, actually, it's the supply side, basically. And then comes the third is the climate change. Public awareness is also very important in terms of the driver and with the index value. So coming to the green finance instruments, some generic instruments are already, I tried to put here some of the generic instruments, but a major issue I was also discussing with yourself on that whether we are actually don't need to define asset class, whether land is an asset class or already it's an asset class, and how under the climate change scenario and in agricultural finance, how we can define agricultural land as an asset class and put it where. So there are debt instruments, equity, debt plus equity, credit enhancement instruments. All of us know that. Then there are risk transfers. But what actually I wanted to drive home here is the financial instruments available under the Common Agricultural Policy. We don't have to go for a rocket science, but we can also find out what is available at a country level, at a national level, and which has significant potential in contributing to the achievement to the Green Deal ambition, and more specifically to the farm to fork and biodiversity strategies across the continents. So this is very important message I want to give, that it is nothing to do with huge amount of work and all, which we have. We have the instruments available at a national level or at a sub-regional level. We have to only use those instruments. Now coming to the global trends in green finance. So I'm still in the general green finance, how it is working. If we go to the, there is a Bloomberg study, what it's saying, that global sustainable debt annual issuance. If you go to that, you will see the green loans is really very, very small amount, whereas the sustainably green bonds are in huge. They are the major, and they are actually ruling the whole debt instrument. And when we go to the World Bank green bond, we found that agriculture is the agricultural land use and forest ecological resources 17%, which itself is very huge amount in that way. That if the green bonds are going to 17% of the issuance of green bond by World Bank is going to the agriculture and land use, it is really a huge amount. But at the same time, we have to also consider that there are some of the additional areas which actually also supporting, for example, the water management and wastewater management. All are basically somehow related to the support services to agriculture. So it's not that green bonds are only skewed towards the energy or other things, but there are the green bonds which are also supporting agriculture. Now the green finance ecosystem. I tried to develop a drawing where I try to find out who are actually the partner in the ecosystem. And in the top, if you can see that the public support mechanism, and at the end there is a green finance escalators. So and you know all this public sector cost cutting and private sectors are all there, but I would like to focus here on the green finance escalators. So what we found that there are 4 types of escalators. As I think I fully agree what Arindam said. One is the innovation incubators. The second escalator, networks and associations like caffeine, Safin, even a smaller regional network like us, we can also be a green finance escalator. Then the research and advisory services, science. Science is important. We have to understand science also and relate it. And then the international cooperation. So these are the 4 green finance escalators. I think these are areas where we need to focus more. Then coming to the global architecture, who are the actors? There are multiple actors, as Adriano also said, and everybody will accept this. But I tried to put it in 3 different parameters. One is the domestic public finance, then international public finance, and finally the private finance. As we all agree that public finance actually can be leveraged to bring the private finance, which is a common to all, not only for agriculture but for all other sectors, even in the infrastructures. So what are the domestic public finance? We are actually, we work closely with Safin and IFAD on the public development banks, and what we found that public development banks are very much interested, but only thing is that they have to bring into the common platform, which we are actually missing the public development banks since last few years, and they were only working with the national level financial institution. So here, national, subnational, budgetary situation we have to see. Like for example, ASEAN as a sub-regional organization, they have a huge budget on the climate, how to support the climate change in agriculture. But how this budget can be utilized? Then the sectoral budgets are there, taxes, subsidies, bonds, fees, and domestic climate change funds. So many of the countries do have the domestic climate change funds, for example, in China, in Brazil. So all of them do have the domestic climate change fund, and the public development banks can utilize it very well. Then we have bilaterals, we have multilaterals, then we have the funds under UNFCCC, MBBs, other funds. So there are many. Coming to the private finance, they are also very important player. The private enterprises, they are actually, Arindam was telling that there are many European private enterprise, endowment funds or angel investors are coming up with their foundations. So these are very important element in the whole architecture. Then the private financiers are also there, commercial banks like big banks and some insurance companies, investment funds are there. Public-private partnership as a very important instrument. We'd like to flag that. Then the insurance system to manage the risk, and definitely the venture capitals, which I think most of our staff and members, they do have the venture capital. Some of them do have in a big way. So we are actually requesting all of them to come and join this global architecture and support this green finance. Coming to the climate smart finance to agri-food sector. So there is a study there was a study made in 2016 by FAO. They have given some promising avenues and potential pathways. Actually, all of us knows all these things, but this is just providing it in one place, that designing an innovative mechanism, which all of us know that this is very important, but leveraging additional sources for capital is important here. Then identifying entry points. It's very important in a value chain. Entry points actually asking you the major research that what are the entry points? When the organization is mature to enter into this type of new ventures, and providing the technical assistance, which is a part of all the MDBs and also the IFIs. Then we have a little bit of a breakdown what we have received from CPI. What we found here, that the public actors are basically very, very active. What we have the idea that public actors are not so active, but at the same time, as we see, the leveraging ratios are really not so high. It's only, let's say, 1.18 times or 1.5 times. So we need a higher leveraging ratio to, let's say, 5 to 6 times, which we could see in any enhancement structure. When we talk about any enhancement instrument, we see the leveraging at a ratio of 1:10, for example, in the credit guarantee program across the globe. So this is very important message that there are activities coming up from the private actors, but leveraging ratio is really low. Then coming to the climate finance and smallholder farmers, it's a very, very interesting study made by IFAD with CPI. And they said only 1.7% of the global climate finance goes to the small scale farmers, which is really very alarming for all of us. Then another is the investment opportunity. If we see the investment opportunity, there's a market value of sustainable agriculture to the tune of 872 billion globally, but which is only 32 point, which is growing in a very huge growth rate. But are we matching with that? So that's a question we should ask ourselves, and we should ask the global community. Then green finance to agri-food sector. So there is a wider agenda for the green financial system, developing green financial system in agri-food sector, which is building on the resilience of agriculture, is critical. We have seen it that in the COVID situation also, that agriculture is the only sector which has given its full potential. And then basic performance, integrity, and reach of the financial system. The third one is the regulating informal financial service providers. That is also very, very important, because they are actually in agriculture. They are controlling around 40 to 50% of the whole market. And then provide long-term finance to the infrastructure, which is very important, and public development bank come into picture here. Optimizing the policies and incentive structures. That's a big question of debates, and how we can use the carrot and stick methods here, that how the incentive can work. Then using the public finance effectively to leverage private finance, as I already said in the last slide. Then there is a study again by FAO in 2018, which says that in a GCF project for a period of 2.5 years, which is full in the book, in the paper, it is further detailed, that only 12% has been is going to agriculture sector, primarily agriculture sector. Then if you see, majority of the GCF project are non-agricultural project, which is 52%. So this is what actually now we have. We have in this as in our pledge. So now we have to change the matrix, how we will do it. So there is a supply side and the demand side. In the supply side, I start with the supply side, although, I mean, most of us are coming from the supply side. Traditional agriculture finance are already extremely challenging. As Panos was telling that when you talk about a green finance, it is a double challenge. So agriculture is already challenged. And then again, green finance to agriculture, another challenge. So it's a double challenge. Then limited knowledge on the green finance to agricultural development. For all of us, it's a new area as I know about the story of the elephant, which portion you are talking about. Then inadequate alternative collateral. I'm talking about here the regulations, the infrastructure, etc. Then coming to the demand side, which actually who will be the issue here. Reasons for the slow move or slow pace of adaptation to climate and natural hazard. We try to understand, but we are still, though, in a process of the last 20 years, we are still understanding where actually we are faltering. Then the good agricultural practice is affected by a range of uncontrollable factors, which in a developing country or even for the island countries, it's a very, very difficult situation. There are many uncontrollable factors, policy environment, natural endowments, and all. For example, in Nepal, we do not have major area for finance. Agriculture. They have majority area is in the mountain. So low level of awareness about the green finance products. Then coming to the innovation. So we try to make four level of innovation which may support green finance in future. One is the innovation in the green finance delivery instruments and the good practices. So I'm not telling here the best practices, but intentionally the term is good practices. Green finance delivery instrument, one of them, as Arindam was talking about, was also telling is a blended finance. Definitely it will have a long-term impact in future. So we will be more working on the blended finance. The innovative mechanism in green finance, for example, green equity investment funds. So there are green equity investment funds in some of the countries, but they are not mature enough to support this green finance to agri-food sector. Then the second level of innovation, the policies and enabler to green finance. It's very important that if you have a good enabling environment and innovative enabling environment, that will help. So innovative policies adopted by the central banking system. Some of them are fiscal incentive. For example, in Asia, we have Bangladesh Bank. They have already started this fiscal incentive to many of the financial institutions if they are supporting this green financial to support the green finance in the country. There are many others also. I may not have all the example, but there are in the paper it is there. Then policy measures at the financial sector. So this is also important, the ecosystemic support to safeguard the investments in climate mitigation undertaken by the clusters of the emerging funds. So that might be very, very, you can say we can calculate or we can monetize. Then the third one is a technology-enabled innovations in green finance. I'm not talking about digitization here as such, but innovative digital finance. For example, blockchain in climate risk crop insurance. There are some good examples where blockchains are being used for climate risk crop insurance, which is a technological, then climate smart lending platforms. So many of even some of the SAFIN members, they created the platform for the SMEs or agri SMEs. They are all basically the climate smart lending platforms. So we have to encourage them. Then promotion of innovative green technology, agri SMEs as an opportunity to promote financial de-risking. So these are the technology part of the innovation. And finally, the innovative risk proofing techniques in green finance, redefining the risk management in green finance, risk sharing facilities such as partial guarantee, not a full guarantee program, but a partial guarantee. I mean, what I said, it's not a final one. We can have a discussion on that. Then integrated approach for physical risk assessment, which is ESG, rating reporting standards. Now coming to the policies, I think we have talked about a lot of policies there, but I want to say like there are macroeconomic enabling green investments which are available in the paper. Then regulation guidelines are there, international regulation, international guidelines, international initiatives, and initiative from the financial institutions. Then what we need? We need a policy promoting flow of private capital in green finance, definitely for agriculture. Enablers for institutional investors in greening the agri-food sector. Broad policy areas to support. Then engagement of stakeholders, both demand and supply side. Then we have a stakeholders engagement, as I always say, that we have a very important players, which are the central banks. We have to keep the central banks in our forum, in our all discussions, and in the conversation to bring them into the platform for providing them with a lot of this kind of knowledge and sharing the knowledge with them, which will help the other financial institutions. Then key findings, we have some findings on the issues and challenges and some findings on the enablers and drivers. So some of the issues, as I said, common definition is a common issue. Nationally determined contribution, there is no sub-target for provisioning on green finance. But these NDCs are very important for a country. Then skewed clean energy development in case of green finance. Then dealing with the downstream. Agri-food sector investment is purely dealing with the downstream or upstream agricultural operation. Then innovation in agri-food, some of them seems to be generic, but it is all of them are very, very important in defining the green finance in the future. Then hurdles in designing commercially viable agri-resilience investment project, which we call it as bankable. Then lack of policy level commitments. I'm not going into the detail of this. Might be some political commitments, also some socio-economic commitments are all should be there. Then enablers, knowledge-based collaboration, plugging the multifaceted risk, policy environment, innovative, tailor-made green financial instrument for financing climate smart agriculture, national, regional, and global network, which we are now working. We are on that. Then recommendations, we have 6 kind of a recommendation here. Are the intensive policy level engagement, which is matching with what is the finding out. Then setting medium and long-term priorities for the green finance to agri-food sector. We do not have right now, which we need to do along with the NDCs. Then promote regional and international cooperation, which we are trying to do. Then scaled up engagement at financial institution level, central bank, PDBs, regulatory policy, all should be coming together. Strengthening public-private partnership for the innovative and delivery, because we have public sector, they are strong in some of the areas, private sector, they are also strong. So we have to find out their knowledge, strength, and also try to match. Then post-COVID green growth push, which is very important. And again, it has been observed and it has been agreed that now agri-food sector needs suitably manage the environmental and social governance issues, and ensure COVID-19 dedicated resources to be used to generate evidence for the future pandemics and disasters, which are very important. That how this disaster management funds can be utilized. And finally, we have our next steps. There are 5 next steps. First one is inclusive representative taxonomy, already discussed. Expanding fiscal incentives, innovations in financing mechanism, bridging the disconnect of demand and supply, which is very important, and strengthening the global pooled green financing mechanism. I think I'm not going to go in detail because I think I have taken a little bit of more than 2 minutes. Thank you very much and looking forward for your feedback.
Thank you very much, Prasoon. I think we can invite Panos now to step in order to moderate the session moving forward.
Thank you, Azeta.
Thank you, Panos. Yeah.
Thank you, Prasun. That was a very good presentation. I think you gave the big picture, and where I want to stop a little bit just to start the conversation. Your first point was about the taxonomy. I think that we need to be very careful of what we are talking about. We don't want to be greenwashing things. So it's very important to know what are the definitions of green finance, climate smart ESG, and also have accompanying matrices where we show what are we measuring here, and back basically the claims of green, that we need to have a very transparent and auditable data to do that. It was very interesting also what you mentioned about the policy driven. And here, you know, I wonder how much the policy driven are also what forces the regulators. There are certain problems. For example, in China, green finance has to do around reduction of pollution. In Brazil, could be due to deforestation and loss of biodiversity. So what are the real problems that they drive the policymaker to change the policies? But I think overall, a big issue here is that how can we internalize in the pricing of products or instruments the environmental externalities, like, for example, the carbon taxes, and so we can provide also market incentives into the system. You provided a very good analysis of the supply mapping. I think was the low leverage was quite important that you note. So there is public and private. Actually, on the flows, you show that we're not doing that bad, but the leverage is small and that needs to increase. I think that's a very important point. We've seen some funds also in specific countries with very active policies to promote this PPP, private-public, and still they fall into this 1 to maximum 2. So we need to improve the leverage. Where I would like to have heard a bit more is on the demand side. That's where we find, and it's not just an issue of low level of awareness. I think it's a more complicated issue. So I think we need to dig deeper on how can we stimulate the demand side. Also on the innovation, there is a number of innovations, but I think we need to get a bit more granular in order to evaluate these experiences and see how much they contribute. For example, I find sometimes there is a lot of hype about blockchains and other instruments, but how do these things compare to, let's say, better incentives or establishing certain other measures? So I think on the innovation side, we need to show which is the biggest bang for buck, and particularly how the public sector, what are the instruments where the public sector can stimulate private sector financing to increase these leverages. So I'll stop here because I know that we're on a tight time, and invite participants to speak.
Can I say something? Can I provide some feedback?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
please.
Thank you, Panos. Well, thank you very much, Prasun, first of all, for excellent presentation, very comprehensive, very, very helpful. Just a couple of comments. The first one was, I work in FAO, I work in forestry. So I guess my question was, the degree to which forestry was considered as part of the agriculture, let's say, frame. And if the answer is yes, then I think in your initial scoping of different taxonomies, you mentioned, of course, the climate finance, the sustainable finance, the green finance. I would say there is also some literature emerging on nature and financing for nature, or financing for nature-based solutions, biodiversity finance, forest finance. It is really quite complicated, in fact. And so I was kind of curious. One of the questions I had is, based on your reviews of different taxonomies, you think there will be one that is most useful, let's say, from the perspective of FAO, trying to promote investments that do want to promote sustainability in the use of resources, but also have associated development objectives. The other sort of suggestions I will have, when you mentioned the domestic public finance, I have seen some recent studies by the World Bank that look at the pension funds, national pension funds. And in fact, even in countries that are very poor, I mean, I saw a collection of statistics for African countries. These pension funds can range anywhere between 10 and even 30% of national GDP. They're very significant. And of course, they have the advantage, as opposed to international investors, to be much more, less, let's say, nervous about the national risks, because they are basically endogenous in the whole policy environment. And they embed in their own mandate, you know, the contribution to development and things like that. So I think it would be helpful to add maybe this aspect of pensions. The other, I have two specific questions. One is in the stock taking, whether the data you collected allows for maybe a separate analysis if we want to look more specifically at agroforestry or at forestry. I don't know whether this would be possible or not. And the second question I had is that I was not news, but nice to see an estimate that only a tiny fraction of this climate finance actually reaches the smallholders. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about it, because this is a problem that affects the whole agriculture, including forestry sector. You know, there's a lot of talks about hundreds of billions of dollars floating and funds being set up right and left, but the money that actually reaches the smallholders are really peanuts. So if you could say something about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Prasun, please go ahead. On the forestry, I would like to, Prasun, on the forestry side, I would like also to add whether you look at fisheries, because there is a big thing now evolving on this, what they call them blue bonds. And we're working in Asia on some of these blue bonds. So when you address the forestry, if you can add whether you consider fisheries also.
Thank you, Marco. It's I mean, I think it's a huge area which actually we missed most of the things, but definitely when we talk about agri-food system, we are considering forestry, landscape, and also the fisheries and other animal husbandry into the whole system. But definitely, if we need to have granularize it, like agri, fisheries and forestry, I think we need more data to do that. But when you go to the data analysis for any of them and any international financing agencies or the MDBs, what we found is always they talk about agri, forestry, land use all together. And agri, they define as agri, animal husbandry, fisheries all together. And I agree with what Pano said, that blue bond and the green bond. I think FAO is also working with a blue bond and green bond. So I don't know how to get the data on the blue bond, but definitely I will ask my colleague in FAO Fisheries Department, Ramon, to support me in getting the data. So that we can granularize some of the data on the fisheries. But forestry, definitely agroforestry is a what we also have. One very important issue is the ecosystem services. So the financing the ecosystem services definitely will cover the forestry and other ecosystem, for example, landscape and all this all together. So that data we do have. Some data at a national level, but not at a global level, that how much has been invested on the ecosystem servicing, financing the ecosystem servicing. So I think if I can fall back to you on getting some data from FAO's FAO data system, so that we can enrich this particular paper. Thank you very much, Marco.
But Prasoon, just for clarification, the data that you have does not include the green financing for forestry or for fisheries. It doesn't. The data does not include that. This is additional.
Okay. Thank you. So I know that. Yeah.
This is a question. It's a question. It's not a statement. I'm trying to find out.
When we go to the World Bank, the detail of their public domain available data, the data is agricultural, land use, forest, and ecological resources. So this is the data. So they have not done any granularization on that, but definitely fisheries are not there. I think fisheries is not there.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I see a question from Bettina. Her question is that if we consider the 5 areas of action in the next step slide against the 4 escalators in an earlier slide, does the paper look at the role of each of these escalators in taking forward each of these next steps? This is the prioritization, like where do we start?
Yes, yes. I think it's a very, maybe there is some. If we can add also one more escalator on the green finance ecosystem. But what we found that yes, the escalators are something which we need to follow, or we have already on the ground. It is already there. International cooperation is there, but we need to escalate that. So that's why I put it as an escalator. But next steps are basically what we need to to push through our engagements in various forums and other areas like a knowledge partnership and increase the knowledge blend on that area.
Thank you. There is also a big request to share the presentation with the audience. There is one of the comments for Prasoon. There is that there is a recommendation concerning the Greek taxonomy that the EU Commission has developed a list of activities that can be considered as green, ranging from forestry to energy and agricultural activities. So. Have you looked?
Yeah, I have seen. Yeah, I have seen that. But what actually, it stuck to my mind that see, green finance in the European Union and also the developed countries like US and European Union, the green finance is to agriculture is not a bigger issue. So the if we consider all those recommendations of EU that will it be effective, or will it be applicable to Asia, Africa, or Latin America? So these are the big questions, because that 85% of the total smallholders are in Asia and Africa. Specifically, Asia is around 65%. So when we talk about the green finance to agri and the food system, I think we need to go for a little bit of a global definition. We have considered in the paper, if you see, you will see that there is a EU recommendations are already there. We have considered EU recommendation, but as a broader sense. So when we talk about the nested definition, we have considered EU, but I am still not sure that whether that will be still applicable. And that is what our the audience and the members today, they will be telling us that whether this is applicable in Africa, or also in Asia or Latin America, where the smallholder farmers are the major player in the whole agri-food system.
Just to follow up on this, on the smallholder, I think this is a quite concerning, although the number, the 1.7%, probably is not very dissimilar about the amount that goes to the farmers in agriculture overall, that goes to smallholders. But the issue is probably as much as the demand, as much as a supply problem. We see from our activities that the majority of the green finance is driven by SMEs, by agro businesses. That is much easier because they know the issues. This is the issue about awareness that you mentioned, Prasoon. Is much easier for larger entities to understand the technologies and the impact. As we go down to the smallholder farmers, that becomes much more difficult, and about knowing the technologies and being incentivized to adopt certain technologies, not just knowing. And also, if they know the technologies, they're uncertain how these benefits, the theoretical benefits, would translate to their specific activity. So there is a lot of uncertainty, lack of knowledge, awareness, and incentives all put together into this. One interesting example is what we have seen in China, where you have these large agro businesses, companies. Some of them, they call them dragon heads, who basically they lead value chains, and basically they drive investments all through their value chains to green their value chain. So they become the driver of that, even to smallholder farmers. That system seems to be working. We don't have an exact evaluation, but seems to be working, that you work with these large companies that they have every incentive to push standards, green standards, to their whole value chain.
No, that's the very important point, that when we have gone to the drivers of green finance, we found that it is not the food security, it is not even the water, access to water. It is basically the policies, the awareness about the climate change, the knowledge. All these are more important drivers than the food security. So the question here is that how we can change that. That policy will be there definitely, but how we can change also that this is important, that the water is important, forest is important, fisheries are important. And they should be the driver. The technologies can be the driver. So that changing or reversing this is also a very, very important issue for all of us. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Prasoon. I don't see any more comments on the box, and I think we have reached to our time limit.
One hand raised, I think.
Okay.
One hand is there. I don't know. There is one hand we can see. I mean, maybe it is by. Yes, I think so. Yeah, sure.
Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, thank you. It's a great presentation, and I'm from FAO. I'm an aquaculture officer, fish farming.
Oh.
You know, fish farming is a new industry, so we have been subject to very stringent environmental scrutiny, I would say. But recently, because there are certain species like seaweeds, bivalves, they are considered restorative species because they can kind of extract nutrients from the environment. And then you can see the NGOs like Nature Conservancy, they pay attention to this aquaculture. So it's a new good sign for this subsector of aquaculture or fisheries. So my question to you is like, for green climate finance, is there a principle about the mechanism to use this kind of finance to reward ecosystem services or environmental benefits? Because I can see when I join this NGO people, they may not realize that if we need to punish those polluters, we should also reward those people, those industry or those activities that provide ecosystem services. I think somehow establish this kind of principle in this green financing mechanisms. Also bring in other kind of economic mechanisms like carbon credits, nitrogen credits, and so on, into a overall framework, just to see how we can really benefit these ecosystem services, and then motivate the development of these activities in general. I think it would be very useful. And personally, I would like to see those concrete case studies. For example, a certain company or community or country, how they kind of utilize this concept or utilize all these vehicles, mechanisms out there, financial vehicles, mechanisms out there to facilitate the environment-friendly activities. I really like to see more of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You did a brief response to that, because basically, we are working with FAO Fisheries Department with NF IO. I think I work closely with Ramon. In 2 countries currently, we are working on a very brief small project of FAO on developing the national level platforms for the fishery small scale fisher communities. So we call it which is in the Philippines and in Thailand. So there we are actually trying to bring some of these aspects, as you said, into a common platform that they understand, and then they negotiate and do the conversation with the government and ask for the incentives for them. So we are working on that. One of the report is almost ready. I think by the next month, 15th, we will get the report, which will be a joint report of APRACA FAO on the Philippines.
Thank you, Prasoon. I think we have finished our allocated time. I pass it to Azeta for the next session. I think there is a break in the middle.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prasoon and Panos, for your interventions here and for sharing your insights with us. It was really interesting. I think we now have to take a break according to the agenda. We are about 5 minutes over time. So my suggestion, unfortunately, would be to cut the break short. So let's have a 10-minute break, and please be back by 2:55 in order to start again with the next sessions. Thank you so much again, and see you in 10 minutes.
Azeta, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. I didn't know whether I had to take over, but you're back, so over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I actually joined 2 minutes late because I was having connection problems. I still have things that are really stuck here in my computer. So I think we start. Okay, so thank you very much to everyone for being back to continue attending the workshop. I hope you had a good break, although it was very brief, relatively brief. Let us now dive right into our next session. This is technical session number 2 in your agendas, and we will focus on the role of the public sector alongside development finance institutions and development partners in improving the enabling environment to unlock green finance for agriculture and food, focusing particularly on things like the use of funds, policy and regulatory instruments, incentives, and so on. Regarding the structure of the session, as I mentioned at the opening, we will start with a keynote presentation followed by panel discussion with 4 selected experts and the moderator. I would, at this point, pass the floor to Bettina Prato, the Senior Coordinator of SAFIN, who will be moderating this session. Bettina will take us through what promises to be a really engaging session on a topic that is really critical, and I think it's of broad interest to our audience. So, Bettina, over to you to introduce the keynote speaker and take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zeta, and great to see you all there. So many familiar faces, and also lots of new faces, showing that there is a lot of interest in this topic. So I'm not going to spend, like I said, I'm not going to spend much time introducing the speakers, so that we are as efficient as possible in using the time we have. We're going to start with a presentation that will frame the session from Josef Zahar, who's an affiliated researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. That is going to be followed by a panel with Josef, as well as with Diletta Giuliani, who's the head of the Finance for Nature practice at Systemic, Hans Loth, who is the global head of UN Environment Partnerships at Rabobank, and Claude Thor, who is responsable d'équipe projet, so he's project team manager at AFD, Agence Française de Développement. So, Josef, you have the floor to get us started with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina, and I hope that I'm heard well. I really like, first of all, to thank everybody for inviting me. Azeta, Prasoon, it was very interesting to hear the previous presentation and discussion. I think this is a very enlightening kind of aspects are brought on this industry that we're actually missing. So I very much look forward to kind of seeing the final draft of this paper. Let me start by, I'll simply share the screen and so we can go straight ahead. Okay, so I hope this, 1 second, please. Okay, so I hope the screen is can easily is seen easily. So I'd just like to bring forward. I mean, this discussion is going to be kind of taking insights from private capital, green investments, and trying to get lessons from it to basically the capital markets current situation. A slight overview, kind of understanding of capital markets, I would say status, and then from there, how does that actually relate to sustainable agriculture? And actually the kind of the focus would be how I mean, after having those kind of insights, what policy or what things can we do to actually to make it happen, if it's regulatory policy or DFI's intervention. So let me move forward. So I think, I mean, here, I mean, looking at the kind of impact, the private assets, which actually are not capital markets, are the funds which are actually making their way these days outside of local economies, external funds that are making their way into climate and basically agriculture and impact activity. So this, in a way, this slide shows the overall, I would say, funds being invested, assets under management. And so if, as you can see, I mean, what goes mostly is from private funds perspective, mostly is being funded are the microfinance institutions versus food and agriculture. So total assets are around 10 billion for microfinance, but much less than that goes to food and agriculture. So actually, a lot of the funds that do actually end up in food and agriculture, is it smallholder or others, in fact, go through microfinance institutions. So the question, why does that go this way from private finance, is that, I mean, the answer to that is that financial institutions are far easier to quantify in terms of risk for international investors. And therefore, a lot of funds would actually make their way through them, through financial institutions. If we look at the maturity of debt for these subsectors, we can actually see that also on the microfinance side, the tenor, there's a far longer tenor of investments versus food and agriculture. And if you look at climate and energy, I mean, it's also much longer tenors. So in a way, I mean, there is this is a funding issue where, in order to make the transition, in order to invest in food and agriculture climate transition, we do need longer tenors, which currently are not available directly through food and agriculture funds. Very small amounts are actually making their way to low income countries. And you can see the yellow lines here, I mean, indicate less than 10%, I mean, less than 5% on all sectors. So most of it goes to developing countries, but not LDCs. And also places, I mean, like seeds, which are difficult to finance, funds are not making their way there. And that's something which deserves an understanding. And of course, that is where it's indicated by concessional funds. If we talk about the blended finance instruments, actually need to come in order to make it happen for those economies. This also tackles the same issue where both microfinance and food and agriculture, in a way that funds end up in the same income, into a lot of it goes to agriculture. As you see, the rating that the funds which are there rated by Moody are just below investment grade, where, for instance, for climate and energy, the funds are lower. So the median for investments in climate and energy is lower than that, indicating that there is a far better, and in fact, it is reflecting the fact that far more concessional finance goes into the climate and energy sector than microfinance and food and agriculture, allowing them actually to reach a much lower debt rating, and in fact, providing debt instruments to lower, to LDCs or other areas which are more difficult to finance. Just bringing an example from Asia Pacific, where SEA Asia is based in Bangkok. So in fact, what we look at, I mean, there are also very big disadvantages for private sector funds, and there is a disparity in financing. So as you can see, as being said before, none of those funds are actually making their way into the very little to NDCs. And there is a disparity in a way that says, okay, Cambodia, due to certain reasons, is proportionally much higher, for instance, than India. So a lot goes to India, but there are restrictions, there are country restrictions that funds actually cannot meet. There are certain other restrictions which limit the funding to India. And if you look at Cambodia, relative to the population, there is a lot of funding going there, which also reflects the fact that the financial sector is quite developed, and also the microfinance industry. So these kind of imbalances need to be addressed when we tackle this area with capital markets. Just a brief note about smart money. I mean, this has been identified by venture capitalists as almost the next big thing, smart agriculture in developing economies. And it's on the wall. So basically the estimates are there. We are talking about 22 billion by 2025. If you can see the graph, I mean, 10 years ago, it was nothing. Today, already a large amount of money goes to agri-tech, deal activity from really top financiers and venture capital institutions, understanding very clearly where the trend goes. So we should be very, very optimistic about it and also learn from trends. For instance, vertical farming startups and vertical farming, livestock monitoring, precision farming are very much kind of the next hot thing that is being talked about. I've indicated some deals that have happened in the millions for all to understand the potential and what's happening. Just a word about COVID. We are not yet there in terms of the financial institutions, and we don't yet understand what happened. I mean, we understand a lot, but the full impact is not yet understood. If people have lost their assets or not, can they actually meet the moratorium following actually resumption of activities or not? There is still a lot of risk in the system. One way out is financing through green financing through capital markets, which could actually support post-COVID recovery. So quoting also Vitor Gaspar from basically the quote says that rich countries with access to capital markets can spend as much as needed in order to cover the COVID-19 crisis. And you can see in this kind of illustration where developed countries have much better prospects actually to reaching the sustainable development goal. So Vitor Gaspar from IMF, of course. I'd just like to kind of touch some main basically takeaways. A, we need capital markets. B, we need capital markets. And the third point is also that we need capital markets. So you can review those points. We do need to go through FIs versus directly to SMEs or MSMEs, simply because it is, when you talk about the scales of billions, how can we quantify SMEs to institutional investors? FIs we can, and they can be the intermediaries. There is a vast opportunity for the agri sector, and it's on the wall. We need to really understand that and engage top financiers in this activity. And basically, capital markets accessibility is crucial and important, and it's also a necessity for post-COVID-19 recovery. If there are many issues with financial institutions, which is yet to be seen. And also concessional funds are best utilized to reach LDCs, but also to increase the term financing. As seen, I mean, if we want to reach the transition, we need to increase to actually reach to provide long-term financing, and this is where concessional funds could actually come in. Just again touching the capital markets, and I think Prasoon has also mentioned. I mean, such 1.7% goes to in fact smallholder. I think it's even too high of an estimate. The whole market, in fact, in a way, 33 billion as private funds going into emerging markets, kind of climate and sustainability. Another perhaps 500 billion would come from DFIs, but the whole market, capital markets potential is 89 trillion. And annually, as we heard before, we need hundreds of billions. This would definitely come from capital markets, and simply there's no other answer. Just briefly about green bonds market developments. It's going to be exponential, and the German government just yesterday or the day before has issued the third issuance with 30 years tenure, providing benchmarks as well for other issuances, because they've actually issued green along non-green. The market is expected to jump to 1 trillion in 2021. I'm sorry, 22. There's a mistake there. We are going to be, in fact, reaching such amounts which would allow a lot to reach to agriculture and rural financing. Recent deals which kind of interest to us is the securitization deal, which goes to MFIs, and other sustainability bonds which were issued to MFIs. These are small amounts at the moment, but they actually will show the way forward, in my view. Briefly, what could be done through capital markets? It's not only green bond or sustainability bond. So we can have existing impact. These are tools that could be developed. Existing impact funds that use their platform for issuing sustainability bonds. DFIs supporting sustainability bonds issuance for FIs, which then on lend to SMEs, MSMEs, etc. And this is already happening, of course. Guarantee schemes by DFIs for local banks, and then on lend, national development banks could issue sustainability bonds and have done so. And all, of course, approaching the agriculture sector. International guarantee scheme, allowing local institutions, investors, that was actually mentioned before by one of the speakers. How can we actually make the local funds, by life insurance, by pension funds, the local funds in the countries take part in this actually activity? And also private sector or DFIs could lead regional schemes, which are actually missing now. This is an example for a regional scheme. So I will not go too much into detail, but this is a typical structure. So we have institutional investors, we have concessional funds, they're coming to kind of an offshore lender, an SPV, and then there are instruments coming to actually make it, to reduce the risk and increase return. So there are FX instrument, local currency, providing local currency, there is a first loss mezzanine, FX hedging, guarantees in the mix, and technical assistance, which actually support. And that could allow for regional programs, that could allow for pooling strategy, that could allow for many actually recipients, small recipients, which otherwise could not access themselves to capital markets. These are the blended finance kind of providers, the concessional funds providers. So they are on the right, KfW, FMO, IFC, but mostly DFIs, they need the governments. They would not themselves invest in concessional finance. They will need government to support them or to be partnering with trusts or in governments. This, so far, 140 billions have been mobilized, 40% of that through funds. So far, technical assistance and concessional finance is the most common form of concessional finance. So either going into the structure or technical assistance. Of course, a lot of it has to be mobilized, but more than that, it has to be mobilized to capital markets rather than private sector funds. Way forward, just generally for capital markets, if issuing emerging markets sustainability bonds, we need sustainable finance policies and frameworks in place. There is now a great bond issuance momentum, and these are, by the way, points which are identified by a recent IFC basically document. Capital market developments and accessibility to capital markets. So if we don't have a locally developed capital markets, we can actually approach a hub, a financial hub. There is nothing wrong with that. Also, a sovereign can issue a bond in a hub and not in domestic capital markets if these are not developed enough. Governance and political stability are also key, and there should be a strong commitment to sustainable development objectives, and that by itself will meet a lot of investors' demand. And we've seen that with green bond issuance by emerging markets in Asia Pacific, and that met quite a lot of demand and very much boosted the issue. I would like to actually focus on this next slide. And this is a very important kind of taking all the key aspects that we spoke about, the insights, the action that needs to be taken in the countries by the regulators, by governments could be split into, let's say, central banks, finance, agriculture, and environment ministries. We have to look at DFIs, what can they do, and we also look at we have to look at the international donors community. How can they actually? What is their role here? So in terms of central banks, it is very important that in many of the economies, the approval of products, the approval of sustainable agricultural products, financial products, by local banks, by financial institutions, MFIs, will be actually smoother. And it should not take 2-3 years to approve a financial product, and lessons could be learned from other places rather than inventing the wheel. There are some regulatory barriers for external debt financing. Some places simply they would not accept debt finance from outside, either from capital markets or from impact fund. So going back to the slide showing the areas, some countries that are not receiving those funds, this very much relates to this aspect. The government, the regulatory hurdle to actually get those funds is very high. Furthermore, there needs to be by the central bank the advancing of TCFD. We need to think in the financial system, portfolio risks, opportunities, and the pricing should go accordingly to incentivize funds flow to the green, and basically provide resilient approaches. So by itself, it will actually move the financial sector towards the green and the green agriculture. Furthermore, there needs to be a regulatory support for local institutions, fund mobilization. That was spoken about before. So in a way, they have their fiduciary requirements. They act like any other funds in the world, and they need to be diversified. They need to make sure that they're not going to lose their capital. But with assurances, they can be provided that and participate in the local funding of agriculture. There needs to be regulatory support for the development of local retail banking products. So there is a lot of retail funds being invested locally in local funds. This could be diverted to agriculture. And there is the momentum now. The retail understand that. And many people want to invest in agriculture and impact activities. And there needs to be, by the central bank, there need to be continuous support for digital transformation, which is a very much key for accessibility of climate finance, and the transparency and impact reporting, pretty much it's all related. As for ministries, finance ministries, they need to develop framework for issuance of green sustainability bond, again, in line with COVID-19 recovery path. There needs to be engagement for formation of local, regional, blended long-term financing instruments. So there are examples like the catalytic facility in ASEAN. It's not related to agriculture, but if they need to engage with DFIs, with financial private sector, to start the dialogue. It will take 2-3 years to develop those structures that would then benefit all. And there needs to be an introduction of financial incentive schemes for a transition. I mean, the same as it was done for energy efficiency programs. There's no, I mean, one-on-one has to be two. And, if we are financing, let's say, drip irrigation for smallholder farmers in a certain location, unfortunately, they won't be able to pay it unless they have also incentives. So the financial institutions will get funds from outside, but this needs to be met by local funds to support them for the transition. Furthermore, tax incentives.
I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to really wrap up because we're going quite a bit over time. Sure. Are you coming to an end? Thank you.
Yeah, I will wrap up. Yeah. So basically, also tax incentives such as waiver for international green debt funding is very important. And I think that by this I could wrap up. There's also a very important role for DFIs and international donors communities, and that could be elaborated further. But I think the key message is that we need to identify what's currently not working, and based on mostly in the private funding market, and then translate that to the debt capital markets and make it work in debt capital markets. So thank you very much, and I hope that I'm not.
Thank you, Yosef. Yeah. Sorry for cutting you a little bit short. I think sure. This was so rich and comprehensive. There was a question from someone in the chat that asked whether you can share the link to the Private Asset Impact Fund report, but then I see that Liz from Small Foundation already provided the link, so that question is taken care of. Let me just move to the panelists. I was going to ask each one of the panelists, what is, in your view, in your experience, maybe sort of the top 2-3 elements of an enabling environment to really address the obstacles to the mobilization, to the larger engagement of capital markets in this endeavor. But now that I see there were so many elements already on the table in your presentation, Joseph, actually, maybe I will also ask, I will kind of tweak this question a bit and start with Diletta, asking what are your reactions to this analysis, and does it resonate with you? I mean, are there particular elements in the enabling environment as you see them from your perspective at Systemic that you think are particularly worth underlying in this analysis, or that you would like to bring to the table in addition? So Diletta, over to you.
Absolutely, and thank you, Bettina, and thank you, Youssef, for such a comprehensive presentation. And I think I was going to exactly share some of our views. At Systemic, I think together with the Blended Finance Task Force and the Food and Land Use Coalition, we actually tried to answer, I think, this question of what does an enabling environment look like by looking at the inefficiencies in the way current food and land use system are financed. And we did come to some of the conclusions, that Youssef has mentioned, and there's a couple of papers, particularly Better Finance, Better Food, and a number we also explored actually and tried to gather a lot of examples of what works and what needs to be scaled, which was also another interesting exercise, sometimes looking at the solutions. But if I just kind of summarize the analysis that we did, I think we found there were kind of 3 areas of inefficiencies, if you want. So the first one was broadly in the capital allocation, particularly when we think about smaller scale ag. And I think what we really came to the conclusion that of Youssef's presentation as well, that we really need to use local intermediaries more. So FIs and MFIs that can really aggregate some of the, and that have them also local expertise, and that can really aggregate some of these projects. And the other point important there is also to really harness the power of technology and innovation. And we've seen how digitization of receipts, for example, can really address some of the well-established barriers to financing, such as land tenure issues, poor credit profile of borrowers, and limited access to collateral. That's another important element there, where we're trying to really move capital where it hasn't, it's simply not going. The other real area that we noticed was an inefficiency in risk assessment. So this prevents investors from making informed choices, which means that they might be investing in land use that don't even mitigate and often maybe even exacerbate climate change. And this doesn't come across from the pricing or from how these investments are assessed from a risk perspective. And of course, what we need here, which also Youssef, you mentioned, is really better disclosure of climate and nature-related financial risks. And finally, another big area was on the inefficiencies around public finance allocation. I think others will have touched on the issue of subsidies. And we obviously commissioned some research that showed that just 15% of the 700 billion subsidies to farmers support public good outcomes. I mean, we know this is a big topic, but what we dug a bit more into was actually the need to modernize in some way development finance. And I think this was also partly what Youssef touched upon, which is how our donor governments and development capital providers, not only they probably need to increase their support to ag when we're looking at their climate finance targets, but also they need to think about how to be more catalytic, by optimizing the use of instruments such as guarantees and also supporting blended finance structure. I think, Youssef, you showed something very comprehensive where all different kind of types of development capital providers can come in to hedge different risks. And they should really be focused on, how to mobilize more private capital to the sector.
Thank you, Diletta. I think that this leads me sort of quite effectively into the question that I wanted to raise with Hans. Also having the presentation from Joseph in the background, but looking particularly in the context of the enabling environment at how concessional finance is used, including through blended structures, to lengthen the investment horizon of capital markets, but also directing investment flows towards achieving greener impact I know you have quite a lot of experience in this space, including through Agri3. So what is your sense? I mean, you know, is he also pointing to the right enablers? Can you add maybe a little bit more granularity to what is needed, what is possible in this space? Hans, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bettina. Yeah, humbled by all the knowledge that was shared today, and I had to rewrite some of my speaking notes as presentations progressed because they are so rich. And really, thank you to Adriano, Prasoon, Youssef, lots of rich perspectives. I work for a commercial bank, and maybe also going back to the comment that Arindam Datta made in the beginning, is that if the backdrop of all this is to make green mainstream, we need to really consider the public and private leverage and what private needs from public and the other way around. And I think lots has been said. But if I would need to mention a top three, Bettina, I would focus first of all on the awareness of the importance of food and agriculture to reach Paris Agreement goals. Within the financial industry, that's not common knowledge. It starts with that basic awareness. Secondly, once that is more mainstream in the knowledge base, I think we need to understand that commercial banks are managed by regulators and central banks. And when we talk agriculture and food system transition, we talk longer tenor, we talk a longer time. And that's also what Youssef spoke about. And what I think we need to really understand, and that's a very basic thing, is that commercial banks do not really have the mandate to go beyond a certain tenor. They are heavily regulated, and for a good reason, which is to protect all of our savings. But we need to come up with a solution that enables commercial retail banks to go beyond that certain risk appetite to really cater for food system transition. And that can be as simple as a bucket for longer tenors that goes into the food and agricultural industry, and that goes to the upstream part of supply chains more in particular. So that's where the public environment could really help governments to talk to the regulators, central banks, and discuss this. Another one is quite basic. Banks, separate from the regulatory framework, they do not per se like food and agriculture because it's a very risky industry. Sorry to say it, but it's just a fact. May sound strange coming from Rabobank, but I think that's where we also come in with a few other banks because we've done this for quite some time. So we need to help banks to de-risk investments in this space. And de-risking can be done in various ways, and they have been mentioned. But I would like to highlight just a few. One is through guarantees. The other one is through technical assistance. Technical assistance is really key. And we, with Agri3, come to more and more the understanding that that bucket may need to increase, and not only for traditional farmer training on the ground, but also to train banks. What does food and agriculture investment mean? How do you bank in food and agriculture? We always assume that banks tend to know that. That's not the case. So technical assistance and applying it maybe more widely would really help. And building that bucket into concessional funding would, I think, allow retail banks to step in and say, listen, I'm interested. And if you can help me de-risk, and if you can help me build my knowledge base, that would actually help me. And then I can really step in this quote unquote risky space. Maybe lastly, because I'm aware of the time, with Rabobank and Agri3, we've had many public-private conversations. also going back to Arindam a little bit, who did a shout out to the cultural connection between the two, is indeed the understanding. We tend to talk about each other. The public sector needs to do this, policies, procedures. The private sector needs to do that, unleash capital. What we've learned, and it's a terrible cliche, but it's true, we need to talk with each other. And what we now notice in the multi-stakeholder fund that we've set up, together with the Dutch government, the UN, FMO, which is the Dutch DFI, and the IDH, the Fair Trade Organization, is that talking with each other about deals really makes it real. And there are all the challenges that we mentioned today in all the presentations that were so rich, come to life in a deal where you do need a multi-stakeholder approach and you do need a partnership, because it's not only about finance, it's about technical assistance, it's about digitalization. And unfortunately, these topics tend to sit with different players. So you really need to huddle together and make it work together. Back to you, Bettina.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this point about, the deals, sort of practice being where it comes alive is really important. And of course, it's one of the things that makes trying to go to scale so frustrating, because it's really difficult to take practice, deal focused, investment focused, vehicle focused partnership, like the depth of the kind of conversation across cultures that you can have in context, to take it to scale, to the scale of ambitions. Claude, coming to you, we heard from Joseph about the importance of financial intermediaries, local financial intermediaries. Diletta picked up on this. Hans reminded us that among the financial intermediaries at country level, commercial banks are not necessarily best placed to lead this agenda. But we did hear also about the role of public development banks. And I know, you have a lot of experience and knowledge in this particular area. And I wonder, also AfD has a particularly a particular leadership role in this space, in the Financing Common Summit process. I was wondering, would you like to comment on that particular aspect of the enabling environment? What is really the role of different types, maybe of public development banks in driving this agenda forward? How do you see that?
Thank you very much, Bettina, and thank you very much also for all the presentation and statements by the speakers before. Maybe I would like to remind that ecological transition in agricultural sector, in land sector, must be financed, and we have to see what are the underlying assets through green finance. For instance, we have to finance new equipment such as seed drills for direct sowing, land investment for water harvesting, plantation for agroforestry, fencing for rotative grazing, etc., etc. So that, and as had been said before, and Hans insisted on, public development banks have a major role to play because of the market failure of commercial banks to finance agriculture, mainly in developing countries. Today, 60 agriculture public development banks represent 15% of all public development banks in the world, and altogether they can form almost 2/3 of the formal financing for agriculture. So we also know that financial inclusion has been solved partly and greatly, above all in countries with tools specifically oriented to support rural finance through dedicated banks or similar instruments. This is why PDBs are very important and could contribute to address both financial inclusion and green finance development. And about that, we have, I totally agree with Arindam, that saying at the beginning about that financial inclusion is the priority in developing country, and environment and green finance is a niche. So it's very important to have this thing in mind. So PDBs can intervene directly or indirectly, leveraging private financing, but it's very important in rural areas, and mobilizing many specific tools that has been presented before. Could be also interest rate subsidy, partial guarantee fund, etc., TA facility. And also there are excellent channels for channeling incentives. And what we call blended finance, we think mainly about impact fund coming from the north, but you can imagine also blended finance mobilized by national public tools, as we see also in OECD countries. So they can channel incentives, and the main instrument for that could be technical assistance, interest rate subsidy, and de-risking instruments like partial guarantee fund. They can help to finance the expected double green revolution because it's the underlying assets we are talking about, and with the management of this kind of incentives, and also with the issue of accountability and measuring impact, because when you use public fund, you have to have this kind of accountability. And finally, of course, this accountability is very important. How to identify and characterize these sustainable practices in a reliable and robust way, because it's not so easy, as it had been said in the chat. And PDBs can test and pilot monitoring, reporting, and verification MLV tools to ensure this traceability and making this public aid or incentive for green and social agriculture investment credible. Also, we can the MLV system can be used for managing the exposure of portfolio to risk climate, to risk like climate or biodiversity, etc. And also can be used to measure the extra financial environment ESG performance of the investment. So they are very important for that. And to conclude, I think that the key challenges for the PDB is, and even for commercial banks and financial sector, is to define really what are the underlying assets of this green financing. Because we can have agricultural practices that are good for climate, but for biodiversity or water management. You can see, for instance, direct seeding systems with pesticides in Southern America. And also you can have practices that are good for biodiversity and bad for climate. Example, organic farming with tillage. So the subject is not at all easy, and we need, as Admit said, taxonomy and very robust metrics. I think another point, very important, as Anne said, is also to educate and to raise awareness on these issues among the different stakeholders, including bank staff, government representative, and also value chain operators and producers. Another point is that in the medium and to long term, the incentives may not be sufficient, because especially if they rely only on national budget resources. So regulatory approaches must be used too. And as Prasun and Youssef said before, it's very important. The role of a regulator is very important. How to reward green investments or limit or reduce brown investments in the bank portfolio, because financial institutions, like all companies, need a price signal to move towards these transitions. And of course, although banks are essential, they will not be enough, because it will also be necessary to support the actors on the field, and therefore, and smallholder in particular. So they need other kind of support like advice or extension services, vocational training, research and development, etc., etc.
Yeah, huge agenda of capacity building. Thank you, Claude. I saw two questions in the chat. One was a question to Joseph about which parts of the agri-food chain are agri-investments primarily from the, I suppose, from the impact funds. You were discussing mostly flowing. As Kathy, who wrote this question, says her sense is that most investments are flowing downstream in value chains and not so much in primary production, which I think I would agree with. You know, I think Claude was making the same point, actually related to one of the reasons why public development banks in that context are so important. So I'll let you address that, Joseph, but I also want to put on the table for anyone who wants to take it on. Another question, which I actually do think points to a very important issue from an enabling environment perspective, and that is challenges around Forex risk, for foreign exchange rates risks, and whether, you know, sort of the CITAITA is raising this question, particularly in relation to the challenges faced by DFIs in the Pacific, Fiji and the Pacific. But I think that is actually a more general challenge for development finance institutions in developing countries, but also for the community in general. Do we have, generally speaking, globally at the regional level, at the country level, robust Forex risk management instruments? So whoever wants to take that question, I'll come to you, but Joseph first on very quick answer to the question from Kathy.
Yes, thank you. So I think this needs to be looked in more detail, but my sense is that it's agricultural value chain financing, which includes production, trade, distribution, and basically other models. So it could be that these are short-term funds mostly, so it could very well be that, Kathy, your sense is right, but we have to look in more granular detail into those funds. Yeah, so I think one key is that the funds which are reaching those sectors are private funds. None of that is almost none of that is capital markets.
Okay, thank you. Forex risk. Anyone wants to take that question? Hans?
Yeah, within the fund and the bank, we have some limited experience, but it is a challenge. Very simply put, some of the concessional funds, and quite a bit, I reckon, are in dollars and euros, but they need to be applied elsewhere. It's very basic. And what we all, I think, struggle with, be it impact funds or commercial banks or DFIs, is that we talk about incentives. And incentives cost money, and the incentives need to be primarily with the farmer, I would say, in this particular case, because you cannot expect a farmer to change behavior if there's no incentive. But if you look at a blended finance structure or a blended finance deal, and you lose, you leak through your swap and your hedge already going from dollars to the local currency where it needs to happen, that's a waste. That's a terrible waste. And if we could come up with structures that prevent that, or we could get additional concessional earmarked funding for that, at least a recognition that that is a challenge in any structure, because otherwise it will not work to attract dollar investors and to create incentives on the ground in local currencies. And you know, you cannot just have that leakage, because the pricing and the spread is thin already. So it's a good point to highlight this today. Thank you. Back to you, Bettina.
Yeah, thank you. Diletto, did you want to come in? I saw you nodding. If not, I'll go to Marco, because I see Marco has a question. Do you want to complement what Hans said?
Just very quickly on what, and I was really echoing what Hans said, and we have found there are some attempts for example, for donors backing, initiatives like TCX currency, which are looking at actually hedging, currencies that are maybe not normally hedged. I mean, these obviously also come at a cost, but there is, I think, one way to create efficiency is actually, the donors to cover that, because I think one issue is, of course, the burden is always on who is receiving the funding. So it has been interesting to see how some of these blended finance solutions are delivered by these kind of mechanisms that are supported by Northern donors. Thank you.
Thank you, Diletta. Marco, you have a question? Please take the floor.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I have a question for Joseph, and about the role of financial intermediaries and MFIs in supporting small producers. And I mean, my question is this: I understand that microfinance institutions and these local intermediaries really work for the most part like pass-through finance. They basically need standardized solutions. They don't really have the capacity to have ad hoc solutions for farmers. So they usually want to see value chains that are already quite developed, business with track records, value chains that are already, with low risks. But when we work with rural farmers, especially in poor areas, this issue of standardization is very difficult. I mean, they usually have a very diversified livelihood schemes. They produce a number of products. The value chains might not be very well known. And so it's a great idea to work through financial intermediaries, but I still feel there is a gap to make this work in reality. And I say, of course, I have my perspectives come more from the forestry and agroforestry thing, but I would be curious to know from you or anybody in this call if you have good cases of how this joint has been addressed. Thank you.
So Joseph, let me, thank you, Marco. Let me also note that someone, Emmanuel, also commented, most of the MFIs charge a lot of interest, which is not favorable, it's challenging for a lot of farmers. I actually have the same curiosity, when you said there's a lot of potential maybe to work around securitization of MFIs portfolios and try to green that as a way to combine the agenda of financial inclusion and green finance for agriculture. So I really look forward to your reply. Over to you, Joseph.
Yeah, I think that, of course, this is a fair point, but it also has to is touching what is being said by Hans in terms of the capacity building. So concessionality coming on the capacity building is actually crucial for this aspect, and needs to be seen at much higher levels than has been seen, let's say, for clean technologies. So if we're talking about the 5% of the financial structure being technical assistance, I think we have to be looking at more like 15%, 20% of the financial structure going into the technical assistance capacity building for those institutions, for the communities, to actually kind of do the transition. This is a transition, a very important transition. So for a few years, this concessionality needs to be provided.
Thank you. I don't know whether Claude or Hans or Diletta, you also had any thoughts on this particular point related to MFIs. Otherwise, I'll ask Prasoon to ask his question, and then I wrap up. No other comments, Claude, please.
I could make one comment if I may, Bettina, very briefly.
Yeah, I think you and Claude as well. I saw him opening his mic. So first you.
Yeah. So I do believe we need to go local for solutions, because it needs to happen on the ground, and you just cannot do that from London, Paris, or Zurich. So we need to rope in the local banks, the local MFIs. On knowledge, I think TA, I would re-emphasize that again, but then again, work together with the supply chain, work together with the aggregators, work together with the off-takers of the farmers. They tend to be bigger. They tend to have a balance sheet. They tend to be sometimes bankable. which provides an entry point for an MFI or local bank to step into the supply chain reality and support the supply chain, the ecosystem of the farmer. Back to you, Claude or Bettina.
Thank
Yes,
you, Hans. Just one point, I really want to emphasize what you just said, because I think when we look at the enabling environment or the ecosystem around green finance, we tend to look at the finance players and the regulators, and not enough to the various actors in the agri value chain ecosystem that also have a key role in generating the demand side, but also in de-risking supply. Claude.
Yes, thank you very much. I support totally that and said, because rural finance and financial inclusion in rural areas is totally linked with proximity, and so we need institution based in rural areas and in proximity with the rural population. And about the tools, don't forget that historically financing agriculture has been taken into account through mainly public instruments, even in OECD countries, and because it's, as had been said before, it's more risky, it's more costly, and you need public tools at the beginning, and the issue, and when these public tools let the room to commercial institution.
Thank you, Claude. Prasoon, you have the last word, basically. So very short, because otherwise we go over time. Over to you, Prasoon.
Yeah, it's not a last word. Actually what I could understand from the question of questions are also that. And so the rural finance industry in the is divided into two parts in the globe. Private sector, rural finance industry are more active on the downstream of the value chain, and that is an acceptable fact. Whereas the public sector are more active on the upstream of the value chain, starting from no incentive for the farmers, for the fertilizers, inputs, the water, all these things. So now we are now at the inflection, the point of inflection. How these two will be coming together. And basically what we found, and also I fully agree what Hans and the others are talking about, that there must be they must talk each other. And we, with my 30 years of experience, what I found, they generally don't talk. Private sector, financial industry, they need a infrastructure, good infrastructure to carry on their intervention on for the downstream actors. Whereas the private government sector or the public sector, because they have a political no interest, they are on that. Now these platform, how this kind of a platform like central banks and all can come together and solve these issues. I think this is a real problem, and this is one of the very important outcome of this particular session. Thank you. Back to you, Tina.
Thank you, Prasoon. So I'm delighted that we actually have private and public sector brought together in this particular panel. So in a way, we try to go for a microcosm of and in this whole workshop, so a microcosm of the solution. Again, high expectations around the paper, Prasoon and Aseta, and I'm sure that this will also help us get deeper into these questions. Let me just say thank you to Joseph, to Diletta, to Hans, and to Claude for what I thought was quite a rich but also quite focused discussion. Such a complex set of issues sometimes ends up being all over the place. So we will be sharing the presentation from Joseph for those that have asked me. And for now, I just hand over to Aseta to take us through the closing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. Thank you, Joseph, and the distinguished panelists. I think this was really indeed a very, very interesting session. The discussions were extremely rich, as Bettina said, but thank you also for being really on time with this, which is also important. So let me get us to the closing session now. My job is to briefly recap the discussion, the key things that came out of the discussions that we had today. What I heard, I'm not going to be long, I'm just going to mention what really I retained or what struck me. What I heard is different speakers really reinforcing each other on issues like the importance of the agricultural sector for the green agenda, the fact that the sector is not receiving enough attention, the fact that the awareness on the role of the sector for achieving the Paris Agreement objectives is not there amongst the financial industry, as Hans mentioned, and this is a very broadly recognized issue. The fact that agriculture as an industry, as a sector is risky. We saw in Josef's presentation that most of what he had in his graph there, agricultural projects or activities were non-investment grade level, according to the Moody's classification. And this is, of course, a problem. Speaking to this, also Hans said that commercial banks do not like the sector for this very same reason, because it's considered to be risky and to be low return and all that. And he mentioned that the commercial sector, the banks need to be helped out here through de-risking. The public sector can do a lot. He mentioned that technical assistance is really critical. Guarantee schemes concerning of what between the needs and what the actual supply in terms of green funding is even more problematic in agriculture for the least developed countries and for the smallholders. And I would also add for some other marginalized segments there, like youths and women and so on. So really the issue of inclusivity that some of the speakers, including Adriano at the beginning and Arindam, mentioned is extremely important, because on green finance becoming such an important issue for everybody and everyone wanting to contribute there, we risk that if we don't take into account the inclusivity issues, we are creating new disparities, new inequalities that per se can be problematic because if the smallholders are really the biggest segment of farming in developing nations, if you exclude this huge segment, I mean, what is the impact that we are going to be making? And therefore, it shouldn't be ignored. Another issue that came up several times in the discussions is the importance of the taxonomies, and the definitions, so that we know what we are talking about and we can measure the effects and we can then identify what is working better than others, so to speak. And Panos mentioned that this is an issue also to avoid a lot of greenwashing that is out there, and we know that it exists and it's a problem. The importance of internalizing environmental externalities and costs through the pricing to produce the correct price signals and incentives that the different players need to have in order to align better with the trajectory that we want to take. The importance of the enabling environment policies and regulations, it came out as really the main or the most critical driver for green finance, as we saw that in what Prasoon was presenting there. We also heard on the importance of political stability, commitment, and good governance, and the importance to have this commitment over the long term if we want to deliver on the sustainable development objectives. That would also meet investor demands, Josef said. Governments and regulators in the countries need to work with all the other stakeholders, really, to support the development and the offer of green financial products by local financial institutions, because they would bring in, this would be the most immediate way to reach the right stakeholders. It would also be a way to bring in the kind of information and data and understanding of the local context and of the clients that these institutions have, and that the others that are coming from overseas would probably be lacking. The development of long-term, this was something really interesting that Josef mentioned and emphasized in his presentation, the need to develop long-term sustainability and green regional financing funds. It was also something that Prasoon, I think, mentioned. So again, one of these things coming up again and being reinforced by different speakers. The need to develop incentives for agriculture to adapt green practices. This is really fundamental. And Yusuf said, like we had incentives put in place by lots of countries to incentivize the use of renewable energy. We need to be doing the same also for agriculture and food. And it's a kind of reasoning that is very difficult not to agree with. Then there was mention of the continuous support for the need for continuous support for digital transformation for many reasons, amongst which also to improve the transparency and the reporting on impacts and so on. And also another aspect that came out of the discussions by several of the speakers was on the role and the potential that value chain financing arrangements have for reaching the smallholders. This is also another very important area that could perhaps be explored even further in the future. The role of the public development banks, as Claude mentioned, can be extremely important as a way to deal with the market failure that with respect to what the commercial banks right now and the funds can do, especially in developing countries. And he also mentioned the need to identify and properly characterize what really constitutes sustainable and green practices. Of course, the financial service providers will be looking for that to make sure that, and not only them actually, to make sure that they are indeed making an impact and they are indeed driving and channeling resources to where they should be going. Now, this is what I had noted down, but of course the discussions were far richer than that. The time is limited, so I would stop there. I would thank Bettina and all the contributors very much for the excellent discussions. Let me just say that what we're going to be doing tomorrow, I mentioned that at the beginning, but here it is again. We will start with technical session 3 that will consist of 3 parallel breakout sessions, each focusing on innovative solutions for green finance across designing investment products to mobilize funding from market investors. Then we'll have another group on developing projects and pipelines for accessing existing funding sources. And the third one will be focused on how do we improve the enabling environment for green finance by addressing policy and regulation structures. The participants will be allocated randomly to 3 breakout rooms for this. And the discussions will be moderated internally in each group. The last session will be a SAFIN session. I want to emphasize that. And it is open only to SAFIN members. So what will happen is that our SAFIN colleagues will be sending out a new link through which you can connect those that are the relevant colleagues who are members of SAFIN can use this link to connect for that final session. Bettina will be the master of ceremonies accompanying us throughout the day tomorrow. And I think at my end, I have concluded. I hope I haven't forgotten anything important. But from me, from myself, and also on behalf of our team, I wish you a good evening or a good morning, depending on the area of the world you are in. And I hope to see everyone energized and ready tomorrow again for day 2 of the workshop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zeta.
Yeah, I don't know if you, Bettina, or Michael, or some others have anything to add. If not, we close it there.
I can't speak for Michael, but I think we probably close and we just resume the conversation tomorrow. Michael, did you want to say anything?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone. This was really an excellent session, and thanks for your great participation and all the great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.